We're good.
Good?
Yep.
All right. Hi, everybody. First thing we're going to do is go around and introduce ourselves. I'm Tom.
Dylan?
Cheryl.
David?
Debbie.
Bill?
Lee.
Gary.
Mike?
Okay.
Lucy?
And Ray.
All right.
This
So
is,
we're live
Yep.
from the city of Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
This is a continuation of the first part of the transitional program that we did, I believe, 2 weeks ago. The transitional program, it could be, I guess, summed up more or less as a plan to a general outline of how a party would conduct revolution by appealing to the actual practical demands of the working class themselves, pushing them in that direction of, a job is human right, a house is human right, etc., and them realizing the incompatibility of the current system with those demands, and how to achieve those demands we would have to take over the production themselves. Now, first thing we're going to start with is factory information. Throughout this, there are several demands that Trotsky laid out back in 1938 when this was written. And they're not all, we're not saying that these exact demands are necessarily our program, but these are a good example that most of which are timeless, so can be applied to modern day. And I'm going to go ahead and talk. Factory. During transitional epoch, the workers' movement does not have a systematic, well-balanced, but a feverish and explosive character. Slogans as well as organizational forms be subordinated to the emphasis of the movement. On guard against routine handling of the situation as against the plague, the leadership should respond sensitively to the initiative of the masses. Sit-down strikes, the latest expression of this kind of initiative, go beyond the limits of normal capitalist procedure. Independently, the demands of the strikers of temporary seizure of factories as well as the idle capitalist property. Every sit-down strike focuses on practical matters, the question of who is responsible to the factory, the capitalists or the workers. A sit-down strike raises the question episodically, the factory committee gets to organize this question. Elected by all the factory employees, the factory committee immediately creates a counterweight to the will of the administration. The reformist criticism of the bosses of the so-called economic royalists, like Ford, in contradistinction to good and democratic exploiters, who counterpose the slogan of factory committees as the center of struggle against both the first and the second. Trade union bureaucrats will, as a general rule, resist the creation of factory committees, just as they resist every bold step along the road to mobilize the masses. However, the wider the sweep of the movement, the easier will it be to break the leads. Where the closed shop is already instituted in peaceful times, the committee will formally coincide with the usual organ of the trade union, but will renew its personnel and widen its function. The prime significance of the committee, however, lies in the fact that it becomes the militant staff to support the class layers as the trade union, who is usually incapable of moving to action. It is precisely from these more oppressed layers that the most self-sacrificing counting of the revolution comes. From the moment that the committee makes its appearance, a factual rule of power is established in the country. By its very essence, it represents the transitional state, which includes in itself two irreconcilable regimes, the capitalist and the proletariat. The fundamental significance of a factory committee is precisely contained in the fact that they open the doors, if not to a direct revolutionary, then to a pre-revolutionary period, between the bourgeois and the proletariat system. But the propagation of the factory committee idea is neither premature nor artificial, but simply attested to by the way the sit-down strikes spreading throughout the country. New waves of this type will be inevitable in the immediate future. It is necessary to begin a campaign in favor of factory committees in a time in order not to be tolerant. And the demand for a factory committee, he's right, he says that it makes a dual power within the factory itself, the people who are part of the workers who are a part of the committee, and the bosses. And the stronger that this committee becomes, it emboldens the workers to make their greater dreams more realizable. If their dreams of workers' control of immediate production if that isn't already in their head, then this definitely pushes them further in that direction to realize it.
A little louder, honey.
What?
A little louder.
Trotsky makes the observation that usually bureaucrats
anyway, I guess we got a good example of it here with the revolutionary union movements in the late 60s, early 70s. We had the God's revolutionary union movement, which was dual power with the, what at that time was this UAW leadership. And they were able to shut down God's main plant in 1968, which really shook up not only Chrysler, but they were all represented in the Wall Street Journal. James and they had a Kelvin Happening and Ford, and there were some other ones too. And Davis got that one in the 70s, when he was shutting on one of them, yeah, 76.
Yeah. He's writing in 1938. Those familiar with the unions today, committees are already co-opted into the union structure. But at that point, the union was down off the street in a little hall, and the workers elected a president, a vice, or whatever. But inside the shop, there was no representation. And representative committees, that's what we're talking about here, elected, you call them stewards in some shops, and committee men or women, and GM they were called committee persons, were voted on for each area, and then there was a hierarchy. There would be a higher level, and then a chairperson of the shop committee. And ultimately, those were fused into the same organization, but they were something of a counterweight. I could see that even in the 70s and 80s when I was at General Motors. The shop committee people were closer to the shop floor. In fact, the GM, they were required, they were supposed to, officially the committee person was supposed to work for an hour a day and then be off for 7 attending to duties and representing people. And you could call, they had stopped doing that and they were pretty much sitting in an office somewhere, but you could call a committee person and they would generally respond. If you had a problem, they would come to the shop floor right while the line was, you were working on the line, and you could be relieved to talk to them, or you just talk to them while you were working. They might confront the supervisor right then and there. It wasn't, it was an immediate response. And there were times, you mentioned the Wildcat strike, that was because the president of the union and the shop chairperson had confronted management at the beginning of a shift after a summer shutdown, and that was when they always sped up production, changed things, it was a new model. So if you'd been doing shooting 10 screws, now it was 12 screws, and there was always an argument. And in 76, they got into an argument, and they were both fired or ordered out of the plant by the management. And within hours, 1,000 people walked out of the plant because they weren't going to stand for them. And so nowadays it's it's part of the structure, but back then it was a big change, and they still have that element in there where they are a little closer to the work, but to some extent they're also a lot.
Well, I think, it's an interesting thing. It's kind of goes to what you started out with, that all these demands, you have to view them in the context of what a particular epoch of period of struggle is. Because in my experience, in some ways, in auto, in the early days, they actually had a committee of stewards for every 25 workers. And when you talk to the old timers in the auto, they didn't go through all this grievance procedure, writing grievances and going through 12 stages and arbitration. They would station someone by the door. So when a worker was getting rolled up, there was a steward stationed right by the door, and when that worker got rolled up, the signal went out and they walked out. And it really did have kind of a dual, it was more of what Trotsky described here. And then by the time we were in UAWs in general, the union committee people had been pretty much being moved full-time. Most of them, they were supposed to work an hour a day, but most of them never worked.
They go to the bar during the day.
They began identifying more with management than they did with the workers very often. And then what we did have in the days we were got active is the formation of a lot of rank and file caucuses. They never necessarily, the league rose almost to the level of like factory committees because it was leading a lot of walkouts among black workers in Detroit. But that spread. In my plant, we elected almost all black committees. and mostly white countries. They look to the example of the Chrysler workers in Detroit who were mostly black. So back then there were a lot of rank and file caucuses and reform, and they kind of had that character. I mean, they were kind of on the floor caucuses with the more radical elements that workers would look to in the period when there was a lot of struggle. I remember when they first brought women in, and there was all this women's oppression in our family. Our caucus really took it on. We exposed the management and did a lot. We had our own newsletter that we put out. There was, there was a rank and file newsletter, and it was independent of the union leadership. It wasn't against the union, but it was independent. Now it's an interesting thing. The period's shifting again, where the unions are so much under the gun that the union committee, the official committee, I think will tend to take on. It's a process, and they haven't gotten there yet. But I think more and more what you see when there's an actual struggle is the official committee often, because the union is so much under attack itself. This is a period where the bosses are much less co-opting unions and trying to crush them, so the actual union official committees will tend to take on a little more radical level. And I think the right to work, the contradiction of right to work, is it's going to push things in that direction, because right to work kind of breaks up a lot of the traditional structures and has a contradictory element. It will push the workers in a more militant direction too. I mean, that's not, we're not for it obviously, but it will have that character. Or evidently it will be demoralizing for a period. But with the idea where Dante describes in North Carolina, they don't even have collective bargaining for public workers. So it's like when a worker gets messed over, they can't write a grievance. They have to mobilize the workers and do an action. They have to continually do actions like that. That's why they hire people like our comrades to be their organizers. That's why they need competence to really mobilize and fight. So anyway, it's just an interesting dynamic, and I think your point is well taken, and it shows how these demands are all framework for how to approach the struggle, but are rigid and they shift from period to period.
Anybody else? Then we're going to move on to business secrets and workers' control. Liberal capitalism based on. Oh yeah. Anybody else want to know?
I don't think I'm the last. Business secrets and workers' control of industry. Liberal capitalism based upon competition and free trade has completely receded into the past. Its successor, monopolistic capitalism, not only does not mitigate the anarchy of the market, but on the contrary, it imparts to it a particularly compulsive character. The necessity of, quote, controlling economy, of placing state, quote, guidance over industry, and of, quote, planning is today recognized, at least in word, by almost all current bourgeois and petty bourgeois tendencies, from fascist to social democratic. With the fascists, it is mainly, I think that's mostly, it is mainly a question of planned plundering of the people for military purposes. The social democrats prepare to drain the ocean of anarchy with spoonfuls of bureaucratic planning. Engineers, I love it. Engineers and professors write articles about technocracy in their cowardly experiments in regulation. Democratic governments run head-on into the invincible sabotage of big capital. The actual relationship existing between the exploiters and the democratic, quote, controllers is best characterized by the fact that the gentlemen reformers stop short in pious trepidation before the threshold of the trust and their business secrets. Here, the principle of non-interference with business dominates. The accounts kept between the individual capitalist and society remain the secret of the capitalist. They are not the concern of society. The motivation offered for the capitalist, the motivation offered for the principle of business secrets is ostensibly, as in the epoch of liberal capitalism, that of free competition. In reality, the trusts keep no secrets from one another. The business secrets of the present epoch are part of a persistent plot of monopoly capitalism against the interests of society. Projects for limiting the autocracy of the economic royalists will continue to be pathetic farces as long as private owners of the social means of production can hide from producers and consumers the machinations of exploitation, robbery, and fraud. That is so important. That's what they do every day. The abolition of business secrets is the first step toward actual control of industry. Workers, no less than capitalists, have the right to know the secrets of the factory, of the trust, of the whole branch of industry, of the national economy as a whole. First and foremost, banks, heavy industry, and centralized transport should be placed under an observation glass. The immediate task of workers' control should be to explain the debits and the credits of society, beginning with individual business undertakings. To determine the actual share of the national income appropriated by individual capitalists and by the exploiters as a whole, to expose the behind-the-scenes deals and the swindles of banks and trusts. Finally, to reveal to all members of society that the unconscionable squandering of human labor, which is the result of capitalist anarchy and the naked pursuit of profits. No office holder of the bourgeois state is in a position to carry out this work, no matter how great authority one would wish to endow him. All the world was witness to the impotence of President Roosevelt and Premier Blum against the plotting of the 60 or of the quote 60 or quote 200 families of their respective nations. To break the resistance of the exploiters, the vast pressure of the proletariat is necessary. Only factory committees can bring about real control of production, calling in as consultants, but not as technocrats, specialists sincerely devoted to the people, accountants, statisticians, engineers, scientists, etc.
Now, that's two paragraphs that Debbie read. I think it's a good description of our FOIA request.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not doing a factory committee.
I should explain what that is.
Oh, yeah. We've, at Gary's filed a lawsuit. We've asked for all kinds of information about the city company, finance, bonds, swaps, all those three-letter words we hear in the financial institution. We want all the background information. We want every bond, write-up, whatever you call it, because we want to explain to the people in Detroit how the banks are destroying and how they've stolen the wealth from all of us. And I think these two paragraphs describe essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to educate people, because right now, the leaders, I think the second paragraph, he's describing the leadership in Detroit, the Democratic Party. They cannot challenge the system. They have this. They actually have it a little easier than politicians that Trotsky's writing about, because they could go and get the information. They're inside the city bureaucracy. But they don't even dare to do that. They don't even do a thing. They do a thing to educate the masses of the people in Detroit. It's real rebellion.
I know, I myself, a couple of years ago when I was working as a dishwasher, I worked in a little mom and pop place, and I was talking to my mom about, how I wasn't saying that they should be, that me as a part-time dishwasher, they should be paying enough for me to, have a house or anything like that. That wasn't the conversation, but more or less, I was being paid less than minimum wage because I was 18, or I was under 18. I think I was being paid $650 or $670 or something like that. And when I was arguing with her about how, a place like, no matter who you are, your wage should be more than that, regardless of what it is you're even doing. And she was giving me some spiel about how you know, all the little places like that, they don't have money to be paying for those kinds of wages and what have you. And yeah, I didn't have anything to really, I don't know, refute that with, but he makes the point. Now, I don't know if he just read that or he said that later, but oh yeah, the economy as a whole, so the entire economy is not Corsi's, the place that I work. The entire, I mean, Goldman Sachs, for instance, or Exxon, any of these places, there's an anarchy in production, and you know everything. There is a national economy, and then there are those small proprietors who pay us. And I guess basically what I'm saying is, you know, basically all I'm saying is that way of thinking is not compatible with reality, in that, you know, in society there's all kinds of laws for anyone to have a limit. And talking about the secrets of the citizen secrets and things like that. If we were to unravel all the information of all the money and where it all is, we would clearly find that there is more than enough to go around, and because of scarcity and things like that, there is that for that.
Well, you know, one thing that, well, it seems to me that what we're saying here, part of it, is that we have a role in a vital role in exposing these so-called secrets for what they are, you know. And so what you have are, on the one side, you have apologists and defenders of capitalism, which will, you know, they'll always find some justification for why the bosses do what they do. And on the other hand, what we have to do is expose those secrets for really what they are, because in every way, at every point, protecting and enhancing the profits of capitalism is primary motivation, you know, in the workplace. So if that means speeding up the workers, or, you know, extending the time that they work. For instance, what's happening now is this 10-hour day that many workers are having. The fact of it is that they could actually hire more workers, put more people back to work, instead of doing this, you know, 10 hours. They could give people 8 hours work and hire more people rather than how they're doing it now, which is rolling on more hours onto each worker so that they can protect their profit. And, you know, we have to really expose that and give an understanding as to why it is not in the interest of workers to defend that, or of workers to feel that they have some special relationship with the bosses that somehow would be protected from. Not at all. If it's in the interest of the bosses to fire or lay off workers, they're going to do it. You know, no matter how many concessions they, you know, bring out with workers. When it comes down to it, protecting their profits is the primary objective, and they're going to do that. And so, you know, we have a vital role in exposing the contradictions, like we say, you know, the whole notion that people were profits. The interest of humanity and the workers, their protection and, you know, their health and well-being and stuff should have priority over the profits, but they don't. So,
It's common in what you just said about the 10-hour workday and all of that. When me, Bill, and my mom and Ray were working for Property Organization, we would be, our typical working day would be 10 to 12 hours, probably days a week. Ray sometimes works 16-hour days. And my stepdad just got a job working through a temp agency, getting $8 an hour, working in a factory in Wixom with a minimum 60 hours a week. So he tends to do 10 hours a day, 60 hours a week in Wixom. Yeah.
8 hours a
He
day.
works two
Oh
presses.
my God.
No.
Oh my God.
In fact, he was a temp
That's
once.
a good point.
He was a-
people.
I don't know. He was a temp working
Yeah.
over 40.
Over 40.
Yeah. It's minimum 60 from what I've. But he was once working as a temp a few years ago for Absecure, and this place, I guess, he said it was a real shithole, and I guess reaching in somewhere, he got a spider bite, and then because of the bacteria all around the place, he got a big staph infection, and his arm was blowing up, and they were cutting his arm to bits and all that, and nothing came of that. That was basically his quitting. When he couldn't come to work because he had a growth eating up his arm. So basically he was fired for getting, for getting staph infection.
Like in Colombia.
Yeah,
That's not far from.
no.
Well, that's interesting because I was thinking, when the gentleman from Colombia was talking, the fact of it is that the workers really should recognize that not only was they in his same situation just a few decades ago, and all the union struggles, which won 8-hour day, and da. But that this is exactly what they're going back to. They really are with these two-tiered salaries, and now here's a person running obviously heavy machinery. He should be getting what, $16, $18 an hour, and he's getting 8, and then he works 60 hours a week.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you have to wonder, is that legal? Doesn't sound like it to me.
I don't know. I don't know what temp agencies do, but yeah, I mean, my uncle's a manager at a factory in Auburn Hills. It's flexible products, and I guess my mom worked there when she was 19. I think she made like 25 an hour, and 4 or 5 years ago, my stepdad worked there. They were making 12. So I don't know what it is now, but I would imagine that it's not. It's probably not anymore.
Well, that's the trend.
Yeah.
Right now, the industry.
Yeah.
Cut salaries in half, fewer benefits, like what they're doing in our area. I was talking to a guy, I believe it was last year, he told me he was making $10 an hour as a chauffeur, no, it was like a porter or something, or pricing. I don't know if he was a temp or what. And he got fired, he said because he was complaining, about the condition. He just got rid of it.
There's a lot of auto parts, but this was going on even a few years ago. We're at a parts plant that's owned by a parts maker which may be union. They'll actually hire subcontractors that operate part of that plant. So in the same plant. I mean, it's bad enough in auto, you have within the union, you have 2 tiers. That's more recent, but it's not that unusual that you'll have at a union parts plant, parts of the plant are actually subcontracted to a temp agency to run. And they're not paid by the company. And they're not under the union contract. And they're considered totally, we heard about that years ago. That's been a trend. And that's more and more the case. And more, I mean, I used to work, I worked on a seat line. I used to put the seats in the trucks, and we made the seats right on the line. All that work's been contracted out. That work's not done in the Ford plant anymore, where I work. They send it to Johnson Controls. And Johnson Controls actually will hire temp agencies to operate whole sections of the plant. And they're not considered Johnson Controls. So that's like, it really goes to what, we've been talking about. I mean, there's a big article in the New York Times today that said how wages, not just wages, but the wealth for all but the top 1% has declined.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's gone up for the top 1%, but for the 99%, there's been a consistent drop of wages since the recovery. And it's in today's New York Times. So 99%, they're not even talking about, they're talking about all layers of the working class. Yeah, I just want to make one other point. The example of like this workers, said this recent action that we took on the FOIA of the, where we're asking really, what he said, we want to be able to get all the city deals with the banks released for an independent review. It's just what he said. It shows how you approach transitional demand. We've been raising this idea that the city should declare a moratorium on debt service banks for about the last 2 or 3 years. And we haven't been able to get traction on it. We get a lot of response. We raise it in all the hearings, and we get a lot of applause in terms of getting movement. And then actually Cheryl raised, well, why don't we try kind of the transitional demand, the Trotsky raised, when they released the business secret. And just that little press conference we did the other day, we got covered, it was on the radio and all over, calling for the city to cut off the debt service, quit paying the bank, pay the work. It gave us a kind of a lever to raise, to elevate the struggle, the class struggle against the banks. It's not because we need to get these documents released to know there should be a cancellation of the debt, but it gives the workers a sense of how you can move in that direction. And that's really what transitional demands are about. They're about how to move the workers into a confrontation with the system. And one of the people who was there with us, who wasn't one of us, she put it on Facebook, this historic action to confront the banks. It was interesting how she labeled it, or he was labeled, took a Robert E's article, called it a historic. And I think we will. I think we'll get some traction on it. Because, people, and the other thing that, he doesn't talk about this here, but Sam talked about this, Sam Marcy, who was the chairperson of Workers' World, talked about that in the U.S., oftentimes you can use kind of frame demand, in a bourgeois legal way, that have a revolutionary in their essence. Because in this country, people always are looking for lawsuits. They even a lot of looking at the law, as if it means anything. And so one of the things we try to do oftentimes in transitional demand is we give them kind of a legal framework that people can grab onto. So for example here, we say, well, legally, we're entitled to all these documents. We're entitled to review them. And we're entitled to and then make the and of course what we're saying is not just review them, but then make the determination about how the city finances should be used from the point of view that they should be paying the workers and not the banks. But by putting it in a lawsuit, it gives it legitimacy in a lot of workers' eyes, And Sam raised that in the context of this country, that a lot of the times as a party, we'll try to raise demands in a legal way, even with the moratorium on foreclosures. We showed a legal precedent for it. Not because we believe the courts are going to do anything with it, or even the legislature, but it's to empower the workers to say, you have the right to stop the foreclosures. There's actually legal precedent for it. And that's part of the tactical approach that Trotsky's talking about here. And that's, I think, the essence of the transitional program. It's a tactical approach on how to bring workers into a confrontation with the system at a time when consciousness is lagging.
So, do you think that when the legislation of the right to work existing now will further help in the dismantling of, really work union and workers' rights? To me, that, if you can have a situation like you just talked about where your stepfather works, and at the beginning they tell you you have to work 60 hours a week at $8 an hour. It's like, and who protects them? Nothing. And in fact, this can happen and there's no real challenge. Can't be any real challenge to it. Or is there? This right to work in really allow this to happen.
What they probably did was they probably stopped saying they was actually working two jobs. They got all kinds of, yeah, so it's probably two jobs.
he's not doing full time on either job. Did FedEx try some clownish stuff like that a few years ago? What they do is they'll say, well, if we would work 40 hours on that one press, then he can get overtime. They'll probably, say it's two different jobs. He volunteered to two distinct jobs. And, and it's going to take the strength, I think, of a workers' movement to say, no, that's not what the law means. I'm struck by the fact that I'm not raising anything for the Detroit police, but they're on 10-hour shifts. And there's no challenge. There doesn't seem to be a legal challenge anywhere to any of this. And the way I read the law when I was in the union was pretty clear. Go over 8 hours in a day. Doesn't matter if you get two job classifications. You got overtime after the 8 hours. At least that's what union contract says. Now, maybe 40 hours, there's still the 40-hour law, where you do over 40 hours a week for a company, for a boss, you got overtime. So, yes, labor law. But they seem to have found all kinds of weaselly ways to get around it. Walmart right now is in a struggle because they claim all these people doing work for Walmart are not really working for Walmart. And the strike, that action a few months ago, I think in Chicago, basically Walmart had to walk back a little bit on that. But that's what we're seeing all across, I think, the U.S. is that they've got slick legal language that just has to be challenged. Because it clearly violates the intent of the wage and hour law.
Well, Walmart, they just tell people to clock out and then go back to work.
Right.
I mean, like, I don't know if they're still working, but that would be taken scattered if you lived there. If it was if you hire people and you're supposed to get off at 4, they tell you to go punch out, but, go back and they work another hour and a half a day.
For nothing?
Yeah.
Oh,
We do it for single moms mostly.
Yeah.
That's why I wonder if I can get that Walmart never.
It was auto. When I worked in auto, I used to work next, they would load up these jobs with so much work on it. I used to work next to the guy, this guy, he would come in and call in and stock up his job. He couldn't get his guy done. This was in a year. Now I didn't tell him what you just had a heart attack. And he worked right next to me, and I was working. I come in, when I didn't have stock, I just let everything go. Before we'd stand there helping me, and this guy's working every break he could have. Thanks for working with me. But that's the even that was in a unit. I mean, the bosses have they don't give it. I mean, that's how profits made. The more they can extract out of you, the more profit they make. I mean, it's just how it works. If you have a strong union, you can fight it. But even with a union, if the union ain't strong. I mean, David worked in a section where they only worked 20 hours, 20 minutes an hour. When they tried to get work, the whole section went on strike. It would slow down, and they never could have work to them. But in other plants where they kept workers separated, and used racism a lot. I used to see it every day, man. I mean, what they did to people, it was astounding. And then they would send people out with time studying. Like people clocking your moves, then something, But that's capitalist. And that was with a union, with a good union. And in other places, what are you going to do? You don't have a union, you need a job, you're isolated. You're going to go along with it, or you're going to get hurt. He's fine. I mean, he's not working. But, they'll fire you while you're trying to get workers' comp, and you can't really afford to be fired.
You didn't get workers' comp when he got the thing last year. He went through for a fact. That's what happened.
In the mid-90s, there was all the parts in Detroit for, I think it was under $5 an hour. It was really outrageous. Now, he didn't work for the supplier, just like Gary said. He worked for Kelly Services. Now, what would happen if the Kelly Services worker got injured on the job? They had a plant doctor, okay, for people that work directly for the auto supplier. But if you're Kelly Services and you got hurt, Kelly Services had to go get the doctor. So you could lose 20, 30 minutes or more and die. And there's another doctor right there, but he is not allowed because you don't work for that company that hired him. And I'm sure doctors, it must cause some problems morally, for the doctors, but that's how they do it. Not all doctors.
Not those companies.
Yeah, you're right. But you see that was in the mid-90s. They were doing this, and they refined it, if you will, since then. So I don't know how much longer American workers can put up with this, but you can only crack on people like this for so long before they fight back.
Alright, I'm going to go ahead and finish this part. The struggle against unemployment is not to be considered without calling for a broad and whole organization of public service. The public works have continuous progressive and to be unemployed themselves, only when they are made with general plans worked out to cover a considerable number of years. Within the framework of this plan, the workers would demand consumption and public utilities and work and private businesses closing of the crisis. Workers' control in such case would be replaced by direct market management. The working out of even the most elementary economic plan, when it uses the exploited, not the exploiter, is impossible without working control. That is, when the penetration of the worker body to all holders and concealed the strength of capitalist economy. Committees representing individual business enterprises should meet at conference to choose corresponding communities of trust, whole branches of industry, economic regions, and finally, of national industry as a whole. Thus, workers' control becomes a school for planned economy. On the basis of the experience of control, the proletariat will prepare itself for the direct management of nationalized industry when the hour that eventually strikes. To those capitalists, mainly of the lower and middle strata, who of their own accord sometimes offer to throw open their books to the workers, usually to demonstrate the necessity of lowering wages, the worker answers that they are not interested in the bookkeeping of individual bankrupts or semi-bankrupts, but in the account ledgers of the exploiters as a whole. The workers cannot and do not wish to accommodate the level of their living conditions to be exigencies of individual capitalists, themselves victim of their own regime. The task is one of reorganizing the whole system of production and distribution on a more dignified and workable basis if the abolition of business secrets to be a necessary condition to workers' control. And control is the first step along the road of the socialist attitude. The thing about this, again, that he mentions again, that he mentioned before, is the workers are not interested in the bookkeeping of individual bankrupts or semi-bankrupts, but in the account ledgers of all exploiters as a whole. Is like what I mentioned before, that one small business who isn't doing so well, who is victim of big capital, he serves as a bulwark for big capital while being victimized by it, and would have the workers that works for him pay the consequences. And it's all related to capitalism as a whole and the entire economy. The entire system is what's bankrupt.
It brought to mind this where he talks about that workers would demand resumption of work in private businesses closed as a result of the crisis. This is seen in Venezuela and Argentina, where workers, especially in Venezuela, where the government encourages it and supports it, to when businesses have closed, factories or whatever, they've encouraged and helped organize the workers to take control of this. Obviously, it's going to have to spread through the whole economy, but it is a tool. In the United States, in the 1930s, in Ohio, and it's very hard, I found very few references to this, but about 8 closed factories were taken over by the state of Ohio. It's called the Ohio Plan. And they put workers to work making furniture, blankets, and some other things that were, and then this material would be bartered. It's unclear. There's very little written about this. But it was must have been some communists involved somewhere in there, or leftists of some sort. And, you know, probably they don't want to talk about the Ohio plan because it was an actual takeover of abandoned factories, closed factories.
What about Republic workers? Who was, can give more of the detail? That was a great example of these kind of issues. Didn't we know more of the details of it?
Well, what I recall, it was 4 years ago, and a little over 4 years ago, and the plant was going to close in Chicago, and the workers were over their severance package. And Bank of America refused to extend credit to the company, from what I understand, so they could pay the workers their severance package. That was the, what precipitated the whole conflict. So the workers took over the plant and said they weren't going to move until they got their severance package. And, that's what happened. They got the support from people all over the country. In fact, we even sent a delegation, and people were downtown demonstrating and Bank of America. There was that whole display over there. Yeah, right. And even here, we had a struggle against Bank of America with this woman named Rolling Parker. Who was a client of the Nexus. And she was a rebel, organ, a transplant survivor. And Bank of America was going to throw her out of her house. Her heart has been replaced as well as her liver. She was a nurse and they got taken on the job. Right. So we had a demonstration the same day of this National Day of Action taking place in North Carolina and North State, raising both, Lorraine Parker's case as well as the covered runners and doors. So what happened was that I think they got an offer from another company, to come in and take over the plant. And a lot of this people got jobs. I don't know how that's going now. 4 years later, they're still working on it. But it was a unique plant. This is one of the most aggressive unions, one of the most aggressive unions that survived the Cold War, which I found there in North Carolina, in the water.
What did they do?
United Electric. We had exemptions there, offices that are still in the
There was, I think, one of the last unions settled grievances by walking out. They were still doing that, I think, in the 70s. So, but I don't think most unions had to sign contracts.
I mean, we raised this idea of workers' control, and as David said, it's a transitional demand, the Trotsky point. Even in Venezuela, it's a transitional demand. Venezuela isn't socialist right now. And when in Venezuela, you have a government that wants to move towards socialism, so it actually encourages the workers. They want to, which one would affect the capitalist shuts down, take it over, and in that case, the government materially supports the workers in carrying out it, and it's a transition to really the nationalization of all of industry. It's a process. In a capitalist country like this, we raise it as a way to promote really a confrontation with the state. Every union contract has a clause in it called a management rights clause. And it basically says that the union cannot bargain, it can bargain over the terms under which workers lose their jobs, but it cannot bargain over whether the management has the right to keep that plant open or office like it's in every contract. And it's part of labor law. Labor law prevents bargaining, does not authorize bargaining over you can't, if a company announces it's going to shut down, you can't, it's not a violation of labor law that they don't go to the union and say, we won't talk to you about whether or not we should shut down. They have to talk to you about the terms of shutting down, how you lose your job. They don't have to talk to you, they have that absolute right, because that's the capital right. And that's the absolute right, it's controlled production. And we've always tried to raise it as a counterpoint to it, that if the bosses won't run a plant, if the workers are in office, the workers have the right to take it over and run it themselves. We've made the whole big campaign on moratorium on plant closures. they would think when it was shutting down, the workers actually stopped working. They had a stop plant closings committee. We did a whole national campaign and popularized the idea for the first time in the 30s. Over this idea that the workers have the right, the bosses won't run it, the workers have a right to run it. But as you said, sometimes you can't just do that on an individual plant because they'll say, well, how would you run it? Well, if you put it in the context of the whole industry, you can run it. And it also creates solidarity. The Republic Workers was great. You did put it in the context of who really was making and calling the shots was finance. Right. Was calling the shots for this little company. So what they did is they linked it up to a struggle against the bank. And it was great. You know, and it became popularized. It gave an angle for people to solidarize with the workers by turning it not to just a fight over the particulars of the factory, but over the whole method that finance capital has the power to call in its loans and shut down a plant. And you say corrupt banks are tossing everybody out at the time when they hated them. So it's the idea of workers' control, which is again a transitional demand. And even when workers raise it, it creates a crisis. You know, the Flint sit-down strike was workers' control. When Cheryl was in the union with Detroit General, the workers took over Detroit General and out of the hospital.
We have other programs out there.
Go ahead, yeah.
If you all do, if you all the work, you know, it's done. It's relentless.
Anybody else? Another reason why this idea of workers' control has to be seen as a transition demand. Because truth be told, you cannot have socialism in one factory. A worker cannot, let's say a plant in Detroit got taken over by the workers and they started running it. They need capital. You have to have money, even a small amount, to be able to sell things to other people. You have to extend 30-day, 60-day, 90-day loans, to protect the transaction. And then you need even longer term loans to continue investment. What the capitalists would do, they would boycott that entity. And you would not be able to survive unless it was part of a massive, ongoing, and growing struggle. In Venezuela and Argentina, they had to support the government. So if the banks boycotted those entities, the government can come in and provide all the loans necessary. So in this country, we're not there yet, but that makes it even more of a transitional nature. Its character is more transitional. And this is important to raise because there are anarchist elements who say if they only want workers' control, this is not a static thing. You just can't achieve it because the banks they'll lock you out basically. It's like a capitalist-wide lockdown. That's what's going to happen. And you won't survive. If a trucking company comes in and starts moving your stuff, then they'll maybe go after that trucking company, and shut the loans down. They've got so much power right now over the finances, and I think it's important that we keep this in mind because in Detroit we run into elements who just talk blindly about workers' control as if that's the end of the struggle. It really is just a stage struggle.
Talking about socialism in one factory. When GM was closing those something like 17 plants, when we started this job as a right campaign, we in Fleetwood, where I was, and I was the only comrade there, the only communist there, thousands of workers. We did a whole year-long program educating the workers, discussing it, raising the idea, had a stop plant closings committee, talked about Rosa Parks sitting down, talked about all different, trying to show people we had a right to this factory. And we're making pretty good progress. We also had committees springing up in other plants around the country. And we're working on trying to build a whole movement. It was resisted in most of the other plants by union leaders. And sometimes busloads of workers would arrive in Detroit for a rally we had with no union officials. And they had passed in a union meeting over the objections of their officials, passed motions to get a bus and come up to our rally. in the spring, it must have been of 80, I think in 89, or in 88. The plan was going to close that December. In the spring, we held mass meetings in Fleetwood. We didn't walk off the job, but they were shutting the line down for what they call break, half-hour break. And we held mass meetings on each shift of over 1,000 workers. I just found one of those pictures. It was so terrifying that our union president, who authorized us to have this meeting in the first floor of the plant, was so scared he didn't even come to the meeting. So I spoke at it, and some other workers spoke at it, and we talked about taking over the plant. There's 1,000 people at each shift. And frankly, we were prepared. We could have taken Fleetwood. We had enough people ready to do it, to barricade ourselves in the plant. But we didn't have enough. We evaluated it, not just in the plant, but we in the party evaluated that we didn't have enough mass support. We could seize the plant, but we couldn't hold it. And holding it would have required, like in Flint, thousands of people from other plants coming, and we just didn't feel there was that mood. And so we didn't, and the plant closed. And we told people, once this plant closed, you'll be scattered to the wind. Your force as an organized working class formation is here and now. But what happened was true. They closed all those plants.
I'm just going to ask, well, I guess it's kind of an open question. What's the step after seizing a plant? Like, I mean, how do you keep that? I mean, you just produce goods and then what? I mean, I'm a trading subject myself, so crash course.
Talking about like in the 30s where they might have seized plants. I mean, they weren't producing anything in sit-downs. They were just holding them on union recognition, and we wouldn't have been able to produce. How could we have gotten iron ore and other, iron pieces? Our idea was to demand workers' control, raise the concepts that this is our plan, we have a right to it, fallback position, better severance benefits or something. But part of the reason the workers didn't rush to this either is that workers at that time had this lifetime benefits.
Which they got out of the struggle.
Which they got out of that struggle after we raised this stuff.
Right.
But they had, but even before that, they had unemployment for a year and a half, supplemental unemployment, transfer to other plants, and that was one of the other conservatizing factors that would have held off a lot of the workers from risking those things. Marx said, you have nothing to lose but your workers unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. But in that period, the late 80s, early 90s, workers had a lot more to lose. And that does conserve, make them a little more reluctant.
It's a good question. That's a good question. It goes to the core of how we approach it. I mean, some groups, when they started, especially during this period when there was a pretty big movement around plant shutdown, they would be advocating what they call employee stock ownership programs and try to come up with these kind of convoluted plans on how the workers would have their own financing to keep the plant running. And they never really went anywhere. And where they did happen, they ended up just being agents for the capitalists. That's not what we're talking about here. We see the demand for workers' control. Again, it's a transitional demand to move people into a confrontation with the system. And so, for example, in auto, if it had spread, because where they were closing a lot of plants, it would have become part of a broader struggle to demand that the General Motors stop the shutdowns totally. And it would have been a confrontation with GM. And in Europe, they won a lot of those. I mean, the workers, it's not so easy. That's one of the reasons they're having this problem, the European crisis, why they emphasize it so much, is they want to introduce the U.S. model into Europe. In Europe, there's a lot of laws that prevent shutting plants. And in fact, when we did the moratorium struggle, we got Congress to put a bill in Congress making it illegal to shut plants. They have mass layoffs and shut plants. It was actually introduced. We spoke at our rally. It was not ridiculous. So in Europe, they won a lot of those. We struggled. Now they're trying to take them all away. Under the recession. But that's an example. So that it might be, the form might be within an industry. To mobilize the workers in that industry to stop, when they first announced the shutdown of Dodge Main was the first big Chrysler plant. It was a historic plant. It was a plant where the League of Revolutionary Workers responded with all these walkouts, where a lot of workers were going to make that the main point of the UAW contract. They couldn't, the whole industry would strike over keeping Dodge Main open. And the union leadership wouldn't go for it. And even the CP who were headed for Dodge Main, the CP came there. But that would have been a good example. That would have been turning into a contract. But the idea of the workers having the rights of their jobs would become part of that contract. Sometimes it becomes the form of a political struggle with the government. To say that the government has a duty to subsidize the workers to keep those plants running. As part of, that's what he raises here. We always raise public works programs, like we raise the idea of a WPA, where the government should fund jobs for workers. But at the same time, it should also fund workers who want to keep their plants going. That's another way, and that's kind of what we've done in Venezuela. We have a progressive government. Third way is to make it a fight against the banks. Oftentimes the banks. And then for the public windows. Right now the banks call that shot out. And to turn it into a political stuff. So again, the idea isn't how to take it over to run it so much practically.
Right,
Because the workers can run it practically. That's the way. That's not the problem. Workers run it every day. Bosses don't run plants. There are offices. Workers, that means hey, anyone who's working anywhere knows you've got data. It's going to go off, right? Then you can get a lot done. Not even some idiot trying to tell you what to do. But the reality, really, these traditional demands are how to put it into a confrontation with the capital. Not to resolve the problems for the industry and these things, but to move it into a confrontation. And that's the approach we take. But it's, and that's the kind of the nuance between the difference between the revolutionaries and how they approach these issues. And, refugees, people are just looking how to figure out how to make the system run. Or anarchists that tend to ignore the system.
Yeah, in Argentina, what happened in many cases, where, they told the workers they had to leave the plants, the plant was going to close, they seized it, they refused to leave, there were huge battles, they were talked over it. And what happened in some of those cases was that they said, okay, we'll let you stay. And then they wound up making contracts with the suppliers as well as the buyers to keep the plants going. They kept producing stuff. And the government backed them up in many cases because the government itself was being strangled by the IMF and the World Bank and international financial institutions. So it actually helped the government renegotiate some of this debt and have some of the debt canceled for the country as a whole. So they saw it as a way of, relinquishing control. So the capitalists said, yeah, well, they wouldn't lose everything because the entire working class in Argentina had decided, they're going to seize all the plants and factories, offices, and so forth. We would have been on the brink of a social revolution. So the banks relented in a sense and decided to renegotiate the debt. That was owed, because Argentina was basically bankrupt. And this is like even in the 90s, late 90s when this was going on. That's why we're saying now, in terms of the camp that we have now, with the city of Detroit, these terms, these bond issues and loans, is that Detroit, if they took a position, the city government, against this useless, debt service, but the banks will be forced to come to the table and negotiate. But they don't want a situation where the entire city, government, unions, all took a position. We're not going to pay the debt, until it's renegotiated or reduced or canceled. They don't want that to catch on. The other cities. If Chicago started doing this, New York, Los Angeles and all, it would be a huge crisis for the banks. If these people, if they lose 1, 2, or 3% profit, it could really be a serious crisis for them. They don't want to do that. They'd be forced to negotiate, with the unions and with the city. And that what, in all likelihood, is what happened in Argentina. They cut their losses. They agreed to, allow the workers to run these plants. see? And the same thing can happen here in the States. It's just people don't think along those lines. They're always looking, to the bosses, to the owners, to the bankers, to work for them, to provide a job, to provide direction, and so forth, as opposed to seeing themselves, as the real engine, for production.
A factory was taken home February 12th. It's a building materials factory, and maybe 18 years ago, like bankrupt office.
One other example of this kind of struggle, and it came out that this week, they've been announcing all these big mergers. The New York Times reported the reason there's all these mergers going on is that the capitalists are sitting on $1.2 trillion in profit that they've accumulated basically by the super exploitation of workers right here in the U.S. $1.2 trillion. And in fact, that's probably a very low figure. Right. I mean, Chris, from one of our comments, one of our comments pointed out that there was 20 trillion sitting in offshore bank accounts that they've accumulated in the profit. But they won't invest. They won't, because they're not satisfied with their rate of profit. Well, why shouldn't we be able to demand that $1.2 trillion that comes off of our labor why should the bosses be sitting at that when you have 8% unemployment? Why should one factory shut down when the bosses have all this money? That money should be used to put people to work, shorten the work week, reopen the shutdown plants and offices. What a basic demand, But no one talks about it, It's never even challenged. But think about it. That goes along with the demand for a public works program. And of course, that's money that's been stolen from the workers. And we have a right to that money, and we have a right to those jobs. And if the bosses won't use it, then the government should do an immediate tax on that $1.2 trillion and use it for a public works program. To use it for what workers need. That's how this kind of ties in those two things together. I mean, it's just ABC. And yet, for the capitalism, but it takes revolutionary. It challenges their right to, it says, what are profits? Profits are stolen labor from the working class. With the money we produce, they don't come from the sky, they come from our labor. Why should they be able to steal our labor and then use it just to waste it on all these ridiculous mergers that just lead to more layoffs that lead to increased exploitation? And that's what every merger is about. I mean, I'm talking to the merger of two airlines. We all know what happens. Workers get laid off, unions get busted, and airline tickets go up, right? And that's what they just did. So it's the opposite. These are just ways. That's the kind of thinking that the transitional approach is all about. Looking at what's going on and using it to develop challenges to the system in the point of the working class with rights and totally important.
Yeah, I want to please, ahead, but I just want to mention before that with all this cash that the bankers are hoarding, if we made these demands, for example, in Detroit, they said we owe $16.9 billion. They said, where's the check for $20 billion? You raise the debt, if you chose to do that, or just cancel the debt and take that $16 billion and reinvest it in the infrastructure in Detroit. Buy new buses, we can hire, how many bus drivers can we hire? We bought another 300 buses in Detroit. We built a rail line. We put the lights back on. We could hire people to do public lights. If we have houses, we build new houses. We can reopen schools.
Fix up Bella.
Yeah, right. It'll create tens of thousands of jobs here in the city of Detroit. But, the leadership, those folks, what are they thinking about? We can't do this, we can't do that. Let's cut this, let's cut that. You heard the state of the union in Detroit. I mean, these guys live in Detroit or what? I mean, what are you talking about? It's totally outrageous. So anyway, I wanted to just look at.
Yeah, this $1.2 trillion that they're sitting on, it's a lot more money than that. We need to always keep that in mind when we talk to our workers, friends, our neighbors. There's a mantra about tax that it causes business not to have enough money to invest. Well, if they have $1.2 trillion in the bank, they don't need any more money to invest. They've got it. But you see, they throw facts at us, partial facts all the time, and people fall for it. I mean, it's because it's a daily barrage of phony interpretation of the facts that we experience. And I just want to add one other thing about the financial manager. It's almost as if the ruling class anticipated that the employers might want to cancel the debt. They put in this EFM that says, don't you even think about it. You will pay your debt, every last penny of it. If we have to shut down Belle Isle, we have to shut down the pension system, we have to shut down the bus system, you will pay the banks. And that's really what the financial manager law says. And it's in anticipation. They're trying to stay ahead of the struggle, to choke it off, and to derail it. And I consider it a derailment to just say it's a struggle about democracy. It's much deeper than that. It's a struggle against the banks, and we just got to keep that in mind all the time. They got a lot of money, and one other thing, the GAO just published a report within the last week that said the losses to the working people could be 12 to 22 trillion dollars lost to the U.S. economy this last crash. Now, I mean, it's unreal, but that's money that they took from us. You know, it's houses, losses in income, losses in pensions, and all that.
They also keep for $800. You know, that's a settlement. In terms of value, sometimes $100,000 in homes that they seize. What happened to the equity? The whole concept of equity. The expropriation of separate groups of capitalists. The socialist program of expropriation, i.e. a political overthrow of the bourgeoisie and liquidation of its economic domination, should in no case during the present transitional period hinder us from advancing when the occasion warrants the demand for the expropriation of several key branches of industry vital for national existence or of the most parasitic group of the bourgeoisie. Thus, in answer to the pathetic jeremiads of the gentlemen with the Democrats, that should be 80s, Democrats, the dictatorship of the 60 plans, should be agents that goes away. Agents, the dictatorship of the 60 families of the United States or the 20 families of France, we counterpose the demand for the expropriation of those 60 or 200 feudalist capitalist overlords. In precisely the same way, we demand the expropriation of the corporations holding monopolies on war industries, railroads, the most important sources of raw materials, etc. The difference between these demands and the muddle-headed reformist slogan of, quote, nationalization, unquote, lies in the following. 1. We reject indemnification. 2. We warn the masses against demagogues of the People's Front who, giving lip service to nationalization, remains in reality agents of capitalism. 3. We call upon the masses to rely only upon their own revolutionary strength. 4. We link up the question of the expropriation with that of seizure of power by the workers and farmers. The necessity of advancing the slogan of expropriation in the course of daily agitation in partial form, and not only in our propaganda in its more comprehensive aspect, is dictated by the fact that different branches of industry are, on different levels of development, occupy a different place in the life of society and pass through different stages of the class struggle. Only a general revolutionary upsurge of the proletariat can place the complete expropriation of the bourgeoisie on the order of the day. The task of the transitional demands is to prepare the proletariat to solve the problem.
When I said this before, I didn't really understand exactly what you mean when you was talking about the differences between nationalization and expropriation when you define expropriation as political overthrow of bourgeoisie and liquidation of economic domination. But that hardly seems to me like a transitional thing. Unless I'm wrong,
I mean, you could be speaking about what we've seen over the last 5 years, where we've had essentially a nationalization of the housing industry, but on behalf of the banks. they actually went in and bought up these so-called toxic debts, loans, that the banks didn't want to, assume the losses for. And now they're being guaranteed by a tax company. So, in terms of, we're not advocating that type of nationalization. That's not the type of nationalization we're calling for, to have essentially the government, using the taxpayer money to go in and rescue the banks and corporations, like what happened with the auto. Again, they turn around and lay off, tens of thousands of workers, cut people's salaries in half, eliminate the reality under the guise of, the government debt. I think that's what could be, described as modernization.
So one of the differences between nationalization and expropriation is that when you nationalize somebody, that's true of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the capitalists get reimbursed, at our expense. Expropriation means we just take it, and that's it. You don't get reimbursed, not one penny.
What does that mean? Just taking it in respect to a transitional demand. I mean, what is?
Imagine if we had taken housing.
What is we? Like, is that the government or is that?
It would be the committees that would arise. I mean, this is part and parcel of a broad struggle. That's who would take it over. But clearly, the federal government would never expropriate the mortgage into the mortgage investment. It's hard sometimes to see the difference. Britain nationalized all kinds of things after World War II, and they were able to turn them back. They were actually able to identify the capitalism which could control. When Poland fell, it was really interesting. There's this economist, sort of a liberal, pro-capitalist economist named Jeffrey Sachs, and he was brought in by these entities, these banking entities, to figure out how to turn back expropriated Polish national property to the capitalists. He said he didn't know what to do. He went in there. It wasn't like Britain where they could figure out who the owners were. It was truly part of the society, and he had never seen that before. He was a highly trained economist. I think he got the Nobel Prize. I think he used to be at U of M. But they sent him in there. There is a difference between nationalization and expropriation. I mean, expropriation. And I forget the details, but I remember he was a young economist at the time, and he was stunned with what he saw. He said he just can't figure out who the original capitalists were. It was too murky because they had expropriated.
Okay,
I think really what he's saying here is there's times when the crisis in a particular sector of the economy where the demand for expropriation is appropriate. It's not the complete overthrow of capitalism. Look at Detroit when Edison's cutting off 250,000 people. Well, what's our position? We should have the right to take over Edison, and it should be run not to pay off and not to buy Edison from the owners of Edison, but with electricity and heat are right. Don't we have a right to expropriate that industry and to the people and to hell with the owners of it? Not pay the owners, not hands, not only that, to the owners of Edison. That's what we're talking about. And I thought our union example was good too. If we were real strong when this crisis happened with GM, why could the auto workers say that we should have an expropriation of the auto workers? That the workers could run it. We don't want. Why did it have to be a bailout for the bosses? They came at the expense of the workers. That was in a particular industry that's the crisis. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are also an example. There's a particular big crisis in housing where the government actually stepped in and nationalized it on behalf of the banks. Well, our position is we should expropriate. We should even out with us. And that's kind of this rally we had this week. Well, that's really what we're talking about. Is that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac should be taken over by the people and be used to fund housing for the people and not used to pay off the banks. So those are examples. I think that's kind of what we thought. So you're right, expropriation could be a transitional demand because you might be talking about expropriating a particular sector of the economy where the crisis as opposed to, it's in the transition to, take over the entire
Right?
We have a question from Keith from Birmingham. Yes. Would someone please define transitional demands and give a couple of examples?
Moratorium on foreclosures and evictions. That's one.
Yeah, transitional demand is a demand that that the workers can put forth that, in all reality, is meant to make them see the general failure of capitalism and how those basic demands, such as a moratorium on, or housing is a right, it's basically the moratorium, or a job is a right. These things are not attainable under the current social structure that we have, and it puts people more in a mindset to challenge that structure altogether.
The demand seem reasonable.
Yes, very good. All right. Anything else, or you want to move on?
Yeah, I can read the next section. Expropriation of the private banks and stabilization of the credit system. Imperialism means the domination of finance capital, side by side with the trusts and syndicates, and very frequently rising above them. The banks concentrate in their hands the actual command over the economy. We were talking about this earlier. In their structure, the banks express in a concentrated form the entire structure of modern capital. They combine tendencies of monopoly with tendencies of anarchy. They organize the miracles of technology, giant enterprises, mighty trusts, and they also organize high prices, crises, and unemployment. It's impossible to take a single serious step in the struggle against monopolistic despotism and capitalistic anarchy to supplement one another in their work of destruction. If the commanding posts of banks are left in the hands of predatory capitalists. In order to create a unified system of investments and credits along a rational plan corresponding to the interests of the entire people, it is necessary to merge all the banks into a single national institution. Only the expropriation of the private banks and the concentration of the entire capital, the entire credit system in the hands of the state banks, and the concentration of the entire credit system in the hands of the state will provide the latter with the necessary actual and material resources, and not merely paper and bureaucratic resources for economic planning. The expropriation of the banks in no case implies the expropriation of bank deposits. On the contrary, the single state bank will be able to create much more favorable conditions for the small depositors than could the private banks. In the same way, only the state bank can establish for farmers, tradesmen, and small merchants conditions of favorable, that is, cheap credit. Even more important, however, is the circumstances that the entire economy, first and foremost, large-scale industry and transport directed by a single financial staff, will serve the vital interests of the workers and all other toilers. However, the stabilization of the banks will produce these favorable results only if the state power itself passes completely from the hands of the exploiters into the hands of the toilers. So what is, it's what we raise all the time, that, it's the banks that strangling the entire system, the entire economic system, because even large corporations, they need credit extended to them, by these financial institutions, let alone the small business. You see, and these people are not willing to, extend the credit, or if they do extend the credit, there's unfavorable terms as far as working people are concerned, or even small business people, which makes reference to here. You're not going to be able to survive. You're going to go out of business, workers are going to be laid off, and but the ultimate objective is the total, seizure of state power, from the hands of the exploiters to the hands of the workers. That's the only way this really is going to be realized. Totally. The creation of a public banking institutions that can provide, incentives or whatever, to people on favorable terms. Because the way it is now, people go and borrow money for a house and they never can pay it off. Credit cards, a lot of people can't pay it off. Because it makes it tell you it's 8 or 10% interest. But in practice, it's probably 200 or 300%. Vanessa and Jay are talking about it all the time. People start out with a $500 a month mortgage, that's $2,200 a month. And where does that come from?
How is the Federal Reserve?
They create, as far as the Federal Reserve to me is a real mystery. I know that they have a lot of power, but they just seem to create money. That sounds crazy, but that's what they do. They're buying, for example, roughly $40 billion a month in mortgage-backed securities. Well, where do they get their money from? They go to the computer and they say, okay, $40 billion. I'm going to give it to the banks. Whoever owns the mortgage-backed securities. I know it's not you. I know it's not you. You know who they are. They're the 1% in the United States. So they get $40 billion a month, money that's created by the federal government. Created by the Federal Reserve. They also buy Treasury notes, which means they in turn give, they're buying, I think, $40 or $50 billion a month right now in Treasury notes. That's so the federal government can operate. It's a mystery to me because there's $1 trillion almost in mortgage-backed securities on the books of the Federal Reserve. And I can't figure out what that really means because they're not really in the public banking sector. But the end result is that there's money being poured into the banking system. That's the end result. And it's money that Bernanke claims will be used to create jobs. That's the legal basis of why he's doing it. Because the Federal Reserve mission is supposed to drive down unemployment. So he says this is going to drive down unemployment, which is a bunch of BS. What it does, when they create this money, you go, where does it go? Look at, there's some neat graphs on the web that talk about, they call it quantitative easing. And the Federal Reserve pumps this money into the economy, you can see exactly where it goes. The stock market goes right up. And then when it starts to go down again, they say we need quantitative easing too. And then it goes back up. And now they're on quantitative easing 3. And what happened to the stock market last week? It broke 14,000, right? First time since the beginning of the crisis. So it's hard for me to know. I don't know the intricacies, but you can see the macro effect, the growth effect, is that there's huge amounts of money being transferred to the wealthy. Its net effect is to cut our wages. We can just assert that. We see the effect of it. It cuts our wages, it cuts our benefits, and they use it also to create a financial crisis to justify austerity. All the while, huge amounts. Now, Jerry's mentioned it numerous times, $188 billion that the taxpayers' money has been used to reimburse Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But there's also this almost $1 trillion right now on the books, and at one point it was $1.2 trillion. It's amazing. This is cash. This isn't a loan like Park was. They purchased the money. When I buy something from you, I give you that money. It's not a loan. So the Federal Reserve has somehow created $1 trillion, given it to the big capitalists. And mostly it's through Fannie Mae, which means that Fannie Mae can then go give more money to the banks by buying up their debt. And I think it's intentionally complicated. And really, that's another reason why we should demand that the people control this stuff, because we know we're being screwed over. If we don't rise up and challenge the Federal Reserve System. These right-wingers, they want to dismantle it. No, we take it over. We make it operate on our behalf in the interim until we replace it, ultimately with the people's bank. But anyway, I don't know much more than that. It's real murky, and I think people that go in and try to drill even deeper than that, I think they get lost.
I add something about the Federal Reserve guys. I've heard it described as a banker's bank.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, it's all a private cartel as well.
Privately.
Yes, privately owned. And what they do, is my understanding, this is one thing, is they so-called print money. But
They don't, the government.
Yeah, the
no,
treasury
the government's not print money. Okay, physically printed, okay. The Federal Reserve, what it does is it, okay, I'm gonna say, just for saying, it prints money. But actually, what it does, it puts digits on a computer in your bank account. That's really what it comes down to, digits in your computer in the bank account. And the Federal Reserve has a formula, I think it's M equals M plus 1, or I equals I plus 1. What they do is, okay, they print money, say they're going to print $100,000. And they're going to loan that $100,000 to the bank. And what the bank does is makes that $100,000 into $1 million. This thing called fractured banking. That's some kind of money. And in essence, they just spray debt. That's all they spray. The Federal Reserve will put $100, say $100 in the system, and they expect you to pay back $150. That's all. There's some good stuff on the internet about it. At some point, you have to download it and bring it in. There's never enough money in the system, because you're always behind the ball. They want your money. They want that $100 back plus interest. And after you pay that $150 back, what bill, maybe you turn around and put something out there. You're going to pay that $100 back plus interest. You're always behind the ball. It's really a debt system. They make their money on debt. That's the best.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to mention that. Okay.
No, but, well, isn't all of these printing money and making loans, what really is behind all this? I mean, let's leave off the fact that the 1% has this reserve nest egg of a couple of $1 trillion. But what does that all mean for the banking and this? It seems to me that isn't this actually a reflection of even a deeper and more fatal crisis? Because it seems to me that, well, they're in worse shape than you and I. And we all know, with the credit card and all that, we're in debt and all that. But it seems to me, it's like, for instance, Bank of America. Now, that was the #1 bank. But that bank is showing a big crisis because it's closing bank. And, you hear once in a while some problem with Bank of America. So, but doesn't all this mean that really this is a deeper, more cancerous, fatalistic crisis of capitalism? I mean, even when you ignore, like I said, ignore the money they're hoarding, because when you go to the house of the hoarder, you see how filthy and nasty, and they have garbage and rats and vermin and stuff all in between, So when you look at a true hoarder, there's not much difference. it's a fatal, amassing of stuff that really it has no value. So, but isn't all of this really efforts to shore up the banking system in this country now? It seems to me that this is like an extreme depth of crisis. But you don't get that, but it certainly seems that's what's going on.
I think it depends on where you stand in relation to the system. Some people have,
Right.
but not, that's not the.
No.
Yeah. Well,
Exactly. I mean, I think I'm sorry to cut you, because you hit the key thing. It's the government that produces money. Federal Reserve is a conduit for that money to private banks or profit-making institutions. Take that mutual mortgage. The Federal Reserve takes the money, gives it to the banks with virtually 0% interest, who then write mortgages even when they write them at 3.5% interest, which is very low right now, and we know how great it is. Well, there's still the difference between 3.5% and 0%, and you know what? Wells Fargo made $5 billion in the last quarter writing mortgages because of those things. Well, why should Wells Fargo take our money, because that's what they do, and turn this big profit off of us? What do we need Wells Fargo? That's what this demand is about. Why can't the government just be organized mortgages for people and virtually no interest of what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? Why can't Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac deal directly with the public instead of dealing through the banks, who are nothing but profit-mongering institutions? That's really the answer to it. They want with Fannie Mae, we should, and then you go to some bank to modify a loan owned by the government. And the bank's only concern is making profit. They've already made the profit. That's, I think, that was the point I wanted to raise about it. It's on student debt. Who issues student debt? The biggest debt in the country right now. The banks issue student debt for the most basic thing in the world, education. Why should the banks be allowed to make profit on student debt? I mean, education should be free, but even as a transitional demand, if a student needs to get a loan, well, why shouldn't the government be extending that at the same interest, at 0% interest? And that's, I think, that what this demand is about. Our demand is, what do you need the banks for? And as in socialism, we wouldn't have private banks. We would not. A socialist state abolishes the bank. The struggle in China now is they want private banks in China, and China maintains a state bank. It doesn't allow for private banks, which means the Chinese government, the people, still have control over their own economy. They want to dismantle it. And that's the evidence. And I think that's kind of what this transitional debate goes. And if any country is right for it, it's here. The banks have been exposed to nothing but criminal enterprises. Well, we don't need them. And yet people will tell you that, well, we have the banks and we don't loan. That's what people say. If we have the banks, where will anything come from? Well, where does it come from now? It's the stolen money from the people that's used as a conduit to make profit, to allow these criminals to make profit, and then extend it back to us, extend our money back to us, and then use it as interest rate so they can make profit. And who needs them? And that's I think the kind of what this demand is all about. This transitional thing. And then if there's ever really this Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac struggle kind of encapsulates. Because we're saying the housing industry, we're not for dismantling Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. We're for strengthening Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac as government institutions that deal directly with the people to provide houses for the people, not to be a cover for profit.
Oh, I got a question. Now, all this talk about the United States, blah, blah, blah. Who United States doesn't owe that money. It's not.
They own the investors all around the world.
Yeah.
China is owed a trillion, maybe. They don't own most of it. A lot of it is owned, it's owned by all kinds of people. Other countries own some, pension funds own some, you know, savings in the U.S. Yeah, most of the debt is in the U.S., owned by different institutions. And like pension funds they make money off of that, okay? And one of the concerns about the fiscal cliff is that the ratings will be dropped on the stuff that the federal government sells to pensions, that they'll have to sell it. Well, they'll have to sell it because they have to only buy stuff at a certain rate.
The ratings so that we can't borrow money.
No, it means that the pensions can't buy treasury notes. See? Okay. Now, the rest of the world still buys the U.S. stuff because they got the Pentagon backing it up. You know, so, but you know, the Federal Reserve was started in 1913 as a result of economic crises, or 1908, around that time when the whole system almost crashed. And they ran around and propped it up and decided to institutionalize it with the Federal Reserve, which is both public and privately controlled. But I'll give you, this just shows how corrupt the system is. The Federal Reserve doesn't actually buy the Treasury notes from the U.S. Treasury. The Treasury, U.S. Treasury, uses the banks to do that. So when the feds buy a Treasury note, they'll go to like Chase or one of the, there's a handful of banks that are allowed to do this stuff, so that they get a cut. They make money every time the feds transfer the U.S. Treasury securities to the Federal Reserve books. The banks get a cut. When they did the card funding, the U.S. Treasury didn't give the money out to the banks. They hired that bank we became familiar with, National Netherlands Bank Trust, the ones that put the errors out. That Bank of New York, they got to distribute the money and they get the handling fees. They're doing no work, they get a cut off the top. So that is the racket that's going on. It's this, the Federal Reserve is just like a station on the way to make it work. When the federal, a little bit more I've learned is whenever the federal government wants to establish a new bank, let's say to do this or that, economic and development, this or that, they go to the Federal Reserve in a complicated transaction, and then the money, boom, pops up in a federal bank. There's a whole bunch of federal banks you start looking into it. So it's a complicated racket that, in the end, we need to strip it away, we need to expose it, and then we need to take it over. And one other thing, there's another entity called the International Bank for Settlements. They're like the Federal Reserve of all the world's Federal Reserves. And they have sovereign immunity. You can't even, their employees, their workers don't even get taxed by any country in the world. That's how much power they have. Even though they're in Switzerland, the Swiss government is not allowed to tax them. And the U.S. has a number of representatives in that entity.
Yeah, I was just want to mention when I was in college, I took a number of economic classes. One of them was money and banking. Okay. So what they taught us was that the purpose of the Federal Reserve was to control the money supply. You know, I mean, there's a truth to that. You know, because they do control the supply of money. You know, by quantitative easing, supplying money to banks, having a strong hold on interest rates, and other transactions that take place. But yeah, the whole idea of the Federal Reserve is to ensure, like Mike was saying, that there's not a collapse, a total collapse of the capitalist system, international financial capital. Because in the 1890s, there were crashes in the first decade of the 20th century. We saw what happened in 1929, World War II. Even 5 years ago, these guys always step in, in an effort to show up effectively. We saw that in our own lifetime. 5 years ago, we stepped in, and they bailed out the banks, they bailed out AIG, which is the guarantor of a lot of these fraudulent loans. So, it's still going on. The whole process is still going on. And even this, a lot of the quantitative easing, it's opposed by a lot of even other capitalist states, because it gives the U.S. dollar's advantage that it shouldn't have in comparison to other currencies around the world. And even when like they impose sanctions on them, they can utilize, these type of methods, central banks, like what's happening with Iran. They're really putting a squeeze on them, even their central bank, because it's very difficult for them to do transactions. You got sanctions, and the sanctions don't necessarily apply just to the countries directly. It's third-party countries too, who deal with them, like what they did in Cuba. Look at that law they had back in North Carolina. Yeah, remember that law? That anybody, even a third party, that dealt with Cuba, would face sanctions from the U.S. Yeah, I do face sanctions. So it cripples, their ability to do a lot of things. They're doing the same thing to Iran. Iran is a very wealthy country, that's the law. Their currency, the value of the currency went down like 80% now. Because of these sanctions. They're not the U.S. These people are very good. They have way more power than they should have. You just think about it. And what right, do they have? To say that you can't, do financial transactions. Just because they, don't like what you're doing as a guest. I mean, it's totally out there.
Okay.
Read.
Yes.
Uh,
Picket Line, defense guards, militia and arming. Sit-down strikes are a serious warning for the masses. It's not only for work-on-day, but also for including 439. In 1919 to 1920, Italian workers seized factories on their own initiative, dissimulating news of their leaders becoming a social network. The leaders paid no heed to the victory of fashion. Some strikes do not yet mean the future of factories in the economy. They are in place of self-work. The present crisis can sharpen the class struggle to an extreme point, bringing near the moment of but that does not mean that a revolutionary situation becomes calm at one stroke. Actually, its approach is signalized by a degree of series of results. One of these is the way to sit down. The problem of the Section 64 International is to help the proletariat vanguard understand the general character and tempo of party positive activity behind the struggle of the masses to have a more resolute organization. The sharpening of the proletariat struggle means the sharpening of the methods of counterattack on the party. The new way to sit down and strike and call for and undoubtedly will call resolute countermeasures on the part of the workers. Preparatory work is already being done by the confidential staff of the State. Both of the revolutionary organizations, both of the proletariat, is against popular. The bourgeoisie is nowhere satisfied with the official police department. In the United States, even during, quote, peaceful times, the bourgeoisie maintains militarized battalions that scavenge and privately armed the public factories. To this must now be added various groups of American ones. The French bourgeoisie at the first approach of danger mobilized semi-legal and illegal fascist tactics, including such as are in the army. No sooner does the structure of the English workers again become stronger than immediately the fascist band has doubled increased tenfold upon almost a bloody march against the workers. The bourgeoisie keeps itself most accurately informed about the fact that in the present epoch, the class struggle irresistibly tends to transform itself into the examples of Germany, of Italy, Germany, Austria, Spain, and other countries taught considerably more to the magnates and lackeys of capital than the official leaders of the board. The politicians of the Second and Third International, as well as the bureaucrats and trade unions, consciously close their eyes to the bourgeoisie's private market. Otherwise, they cannot preserve their alliance for even 24 hours. The reformers systematically implant in the minds of the workers the notion that the sacredness of democracy is best guaranteed when the bourgeoisie is armed with teeth and the workers are unarmed. The duty of the Fourth International is to put an end to the slavish policy once and for all. The petty bourgeois Democrats, including social democrats, Stalinists and anarchists, yell louder about the struggle against fascism. More cravenly, they capitulate to it and all that stuff. Only armed workers and captains who feel the support comfortably and control behind them successfully prevail against the fascist. The struggle against fascism does not start in the liberal editorial office, but in the factory and empty. Scavenging private government and factory plants are the basic nuclei of the fascists. Strike pickets are the basic nuclei of proletariat. This is our point of departure. In connection with every strike, street demonstration, it is imperative to propagate the necessity of creating workers' groups with self-defense. It is necessary to write the slogan and program of the revolutionary demonstration. It is imperative where possible, beginning with the youth group, to organize in self-defense, to drill and equip themselves with these laws. The new upsurge of the mass movement served not only to increase the number of these movements, but also to unite them according to neighborhoods, cities, and regions. It is necessary to give organized expression to the valid nature of the workers versus scabs and bands and gangsters and fascists. It is necessary to advance the slogan for workers' militia as one serious guarantee to the inviolability of the workers' organization, meeting this process. Only with the help of such systematic, persistent, indefatigable, courageous, agitational, and organizational work, always on the basis of experience and masters themselves, is it possible to root out from their consciousness the traditions of submissiveness and facility. The trained advances of heroic fighters capable of setting an example of all cultures, to inflict a series of tactical defeats upon the harmful of the counter-revolution, to raise the self-confidence of the exploited and oppressed, compromise fascism in the eyes of the petty bourgeoisie, and pave the road for a conquest of power by the proletariat. Engels defines the state as, quote, body's army. The arming of the proletariat is an imperative concomitant element to the struggle for liberation. When the proletariat is over, it will find the road and needs to arm. In this field also, leadership falls naturally to second. And he is absolutely right when talking about workers organizing self-defense. February 2nd, something I can't get over, was a video of the Golden Dawn, this big rally that they had, of a minimum 5,000 people. I've heard 5,000 to 50,000, which there's a giant discrepancy, obviously, between 5,000 and 50,000. But either way, 5,000 is big enough. You should see this video. It's about 2 minutes long, and it's dark. There's like smoke and lights and a bunch of torches and big Greek flags, and everyone's chanting in unison. And oh man, it shakes me to the core. And I don't know of any. I don't know what the counterweight to that is in Europe exactly. I don't know. I'm not sure that there's a proletarian vanguard anywhere near the standing of the Golden Dawn, and that these are people who, like, if you even look up a picture of the Golden Dawn's leader, you won't find one without like some big muscle dude with like tattoos and like a beard sitting next to him, and like their rallies tend to have big, clad in black people who are
Fascists.
yes, yeah, and I'm not aware of anything like that that the proletariat has, and that's something that's alarming.
Well, we can I put it, well, I was just gonna say that one of the things that every time I think about the word revolution, seriously, is it involves blood. I mean, it's sort of very important. I mean, of course, you gotta be real about revolution. You have to die.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because, when capitalism is in crisis, there's going to be could be a split, among the people. Even sections of the working class go over to the fascists. So revenue, and here we see the so-called patriot movement that came out of the 90s, the Tea Party movement came out, a few years ago. But we know these movements are backed up, by the women's club. It's not a real indigenous movement. It's taking place, but we used. You know, it's not, you know, not, so people, you know, we have to educate people. Because, you know, some people can get swept away in it. Because they told us something all the time. You know, even the ruling. But some of their rhetoric is, you know, they say they're against the government, some say they're against the banks. You know, we get it, but, you know, to give it away, you know, you see that what they're really advocating, you know, it's fine.
Yeah, I think in the United States, especially, the fascist movement is going to employ, of course, racism. And because that's, it's real easy to cleave the working class right now. You cap on that, and you split along racial lines. I think we saw that with the Tea Party. That was a white movement. I'm clearly white. A lot of it was petty bourgeois, but it did attract some workers. But they were white workers, backward white workers, who don't even know what they're fighting for. They're fighting for actually, and they end up fighting against their own interests. But there's something positive. You know, there's something the UAW has called the Flying Squadron, I think, Flying Pickets, whatever. You know, we saw them in the newspaper strike, and they basically are there to just reinforce, you know, workers' actions at plants. And you don't see them in action that much anymore. But the ones, there's some activists, Gary King in Local 140, he wants to change their constitution, their local bylaws, to allow this grouping to come to homeowners' defenses when needed. So it's a nice to see that coming out in the consciousness of workers in struggle, that they want to take this idea and use it to defend not just workers at a plant, but the community when the banks come after them. It's a long ways from armed worker militias, but it's an interesting development that he wants to do that, you know, at the local level.
You know, this last thing, I've been reading some of the work of Theodore doesn't have. And he has this thesis where he says that he wrote about the invention of the white race. He says that the white race is a ruling class social control formation that came out of the U.S. shortly after Bacon's Rebellion. And during Bacon's Rebellion, you know, black, white, pink, polka dot folks got together, and they were gonna, you know, kick ass in terms of the ruling class. And the ruling class saw that and decided, oh no, we cannot have all these people on the same team. So we will create this quote-unquote white race. Before the white race, people were English, people were Scottish, people were Irish, people were Finnish, people were, you know, that kind of thing. This white race thing is a ruling class formation for social control, and its goal is to keep laborers separated at each other's throats. The ruling class gave the white race some little privileges, and the white race wants those privileges. Anybody can want those privileges. So the white race wants those privileges, and their job is to keep everybody else out. They work for the damn ruling class.
I just had one other thing on the Federal Reserve that I forgot. You know, a couple of years ago, I asked Hanson Clark to raise with him the idea of why not the Federal Reserve buy up the city debt, right? And just park it, and then we forget about it. And then he had a staff member call me up to get the details of what I was talking about. They were excited about it, and I didn't hear anything more.
Who was this now?
Hanson Clark saying,
Oh, yeah, right.
okay. So then I said, now why can't the feds buy up municipal debt? It's in the law that they can't.
Yeah, right.
They can only buy bank debt. They can buy municipal debt if it's short term, less than 6 months.
Wow.
What municipality issues 6-month bonds?
Wow.
You know? I mean, I read this and I went, this makes it stark and clear that the Federal Reserve is there to prop up the banks and the banks. Because you could imagine creating a public bank that funds municipalities. It wouldn't be subjected to all this BS. But they put in the bankers that put in the law. No. This is just for us.
So, yeah.
It's really, the only point just like this is, a lot of ways we're speaking ideologically. I mean, like our position is we don't believe in free speech for the Klan. We don't believe in free speech for Nazis. When the Tea Party met, we were the only political organization that demonstrated against them because we understand that fascism is becomes the military arm of the ruling class in a period of crisis. And we need to confront those fascists and expose what they're really about. And that's really, I think, what we're, I mean, workers will fight. I mean, during the newspaper strike, it was never a question of whether the rank and file workers would fight the staff. I mean, it wasn't like the left had to do the fighting. The workers in this country, they'll fight. That's not the issue. But it's more of the ideological perspective of the left. And we have to understand what these neo-fascist groups are about, and that really they're there to, during periods of extreme crisis, they're there to be unleashed by the front of this movement, and they have to be used military formation, even in their infancy, which is kind of where we're at in this country. It doesn't mean we have to obsess about them, because at this point, our main task is we got to mobilize our own class. But on the other hand, we have a consciousness about them that does say that, speaks to what we're talking about here. And we have always done that. Whenever the claims appear, we have kind of come up with a free speech draft. We believe in running them, and where possible, kicking their ass. And same with Nazis. But we want to show, we don't want to allow them to grow freely to where in a period of crisis and be moving at least and back them. What makes it.
I mean, in Germany, it was the industrial. It would facilitate the business rather than time.
Cold brother. Cold brother.
It's not funny, but but hey, it's what's happening.
All right. Trotsky had I think Trotsky said this. You need to appoint the heads of the fascist behavior. All right. So probably.
Okay, you got still another section.
Yeah, she did.
What's up there?
We only got 7 minutes. Yeah, we got like maybe a quarter. Oh, I want to make an announcement. Many of you know already, Tashi Kia passed away Wednesday morning, and very sad. He was a comrade. He left the ranch around the time when he got sick, when he got seriously sick, cancer and whatnot. But he wants to donate all of his books to us with his public library. Okay, so 5 o'clock. We're supposed to go to his place tomorrow. Pick him up now. The description I have is the bookshelf's about this high. I guess it was about this wide. It's full of political books. So we're supposed to meet his stepdaughter at 5. Now, we're going to need help because there's a lot of books to move, but it's a great one. Okay. If you know where he lived, it's at State and Griswold. I think it would be good if we could meet down there, or maybe some people could meet here. And if you have boxes, 30 boxes, bring them, because I don't have enough. But it's a generous thing, and I think we need, in addition, when people donate significant amounts, make a little plaque or something in our library acknowledging that donation. We have more books coming from Cleveland as well. We're going to have a nice library. Now, Tashi was interested in black nationalist stuff, anti-imperialist stuff. He has a lot of classic works from, that some of us are familiar with. It's going to be a very good addition here, and I thank Linda for helping set this up. And then his funeral will be sometime next week, when we get word on it. He'll be buried in Detroit somewhere. Service to be here. So, he'll be missed. He was interesting. For me anyway. He reached back toward struggles back in the 70s and 60s that I was barely aware of. He was part of the George Jackson Brigade in prison, I believe. So anyway, I need help tomorrow. I think Lee David's going to bring a few people. And if anyone has a truck or a dolly, you know, that would probably be helpful. There is an elevator, right?
Yes, okay. What was it?
Yeah, it's you're on the way up there, 11th floor.
11th floor,
Yeah,
floor.
so, but anyway, it's going to be a nice addition for it. You're going to have a library, set up a library, right? Yeah, I think, you guys, yeah. So anyway, need some help. And if anyone's going, let me know, because if there's a change of plans, I can let you know, okay? I can't talk to you.
Well, thanks for the,